guys, welcome to this new video. Today we're going to talk about cluster role binding, right? Cluster role binding. Now, if you are familiar with role binding, you'll be familiar with cluster role binding easily. So let me start from the beginning when it comes to permission. In Kubernetes, we are going to have role. A role is just a set of rules, and that set of rules is only applicable to a specific namespace. And so a role is just a set of rules on the particular resources. That resource can be pod, that resource can be config map, that resource can be a node, not a node. That resource can be, for example, multiple things. So it's just a rule, just a rule. But that is only applicable on the namespace. Then you have the role binding. The role binding is just attaching the role to a specific user or service account. That's called the role binding. And the role binding is only applicable. The role binding is only applicable on the specific namespace. Then you have the cluster role. The cluster role is just like the role, but the only difference that the cluster role is applicable at the cluster level, meaning that it's applicable at all namespace level. Then now we are going to talk about the cluster role binding, which is just like the role binding, and the only difference is that the role binding is applicable only on the specific namespace, but the cluster role binding is applicable on all namespaces. So that's just the only difference. And just cluster role is just attaching a cluster role binding is just attaching a cluster role to a specific user or namespace. You can also attach that to a specific group. Like you see here, for example, we have this cluster role binding is applicable to this user called John Doe, and the resource here is applicable to this user John Doe, is applicable to the group admin. And if you go down, you will see that there is also applicable to this service account, right? But look at here, example cluster role. So here it references the cluster role that is being used. Now, you can attach a cluster role with a cluster binding, but your cluster role, the cluster role binding can specifically refer to a cluster role. It cannot refer to a role, right? That's only different. Now, on the definition on the right side, say a cluster role binding is a cluster level, right? Cluster level resource in Kubernetes that grant a permission defined in cluster role to user, group, or service account. Unlike role binding, which are namespace scope, cluster role binding apply across the entire cluster. I hope you guys like the video and see you guys in the next video. Thank you.